we would get out the statistical reports and go through the data. Much of the counsel of those brethren that came to help us was to strengthen our stake and to point out maybe where we could do better. Many of those situations were a little stressful.
I bet,
and pointing out, well, yeah, you've done great here. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about where you need to do better. And I remember clearly when Howard W. Hunter was the president of the Quorum of the 12, and he assigned himself to come to our stake to preside over a stake conference.
Oh, wow.
And I remember he was nearing the end of his life at the time, was in a wheelchair. But I remember clearly when he came in to our Saturday meeting, and church security brought him into my office and closed the door, and it was President Hunter and me. I sat in my chair, he was sitting next to me, and I thought, well, here is where he's going to help me find out where we need to be better as a stake. And I'll never forget this. He looked at me and said, President Luker, what can I do to help you? The feeling of emotion and love that came from him as we spent time together discussing the joys and the challenges of serving in priesthood leadership. And the details of much of that conversation have since left. I mean, I've had a few sunrises and sunsets in my life, but I hope I will never forget the great emotion I felt as the president of the Quorum of the 12, Howard Hunter, who soon became the president of the church, had those few precious moments with me.
Leading Saints, back on your dial here. Thanks for pressing play. It really means a lot that you'd come here and listen, and hopefully I always try to make the title as enticing as possible, but nonetheless, you've landed here, and I'm excited for this episode, kind of a personal episode for me, where I'm going to take you on a journey on memory lane here, talking with some people from my past, because here was the original idea. I wanted, as I've heard stories of church leadership, in our faith tradition from the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was such a different world back then, right? It was different to be a bishop in the 1980s as it is to be a bishop in the 2020s, right? And I was curious, it'd be interesting to hear about that. Just like we go to foreign lands or international lands to hear about what's it like being a bishop in Spain, or being a bishop in El Salvador, or whatever it is. What was it like being a bishop in the 70s or in the 80s? And I put a call out to individuals to participate in that, and didn't get too many responses back. And then it occurred to me, wait a minute, I have access to some remarkable mentors from my past who could step up and do this. And one of them being my father, Rick Francom, who's part of this episode, Bill Luker, who was his stake president when my father was bishop, and then Lynn Peterson, who is also a former bishop and in stake presidencies, and was bishop during a time, in the early 80s when even we got rid of the block schedule, or I'm sorry, when we got the block schedule, right? And it was a new way to doing church. And so everything from, what was it like doing finances or welfare or leading a meeting, or what were the concerns that you were really losing sleep over in the 1980s that maybe were different than what we're faced with today? And so it was a fun conversation from some wise minds. And I love all three of these individuals so much, and they've had an impact on my life. And so I'm excited to introduce them to you. And hopefully you enjoy this conversation. I would love for, as you maybe reflect back on your own journey, or if you know somebody who is a leader back in these several decades ago, maybe they can reach out and share their own experience, either on a comment on this post, or we can feature them in another episode. It'd be fun to hear. So let's go back to the 1980s, to the 1970s and beyond, and talk about what was it like being a church leader in the 1980s. Welcome back to a special episode of the Leading Saints podcast. Today, I scour the earth and my history for the legends of legends when it comes to church leadership, and these three is who showed up. So I'm excited we'll first start with the gentleman to my right here. Now, you may realize that I get all my good looks from this guy. This is Rick Francom. I call him Dad, but thanks for coming, Dad.
I'm glad to be here.
Good. Awesome. Bill Luker, maybe put yourself in context real quick. How do you introduce yourself?
Well, associated with these guys, we raised our families together in the same ward back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And,
That's right.
Just great associations that have precious memories.
You live 2 doors down from us, right?
Absolutely. 2 doors from the Francoms.
And that's awesome. Lynn?
Well, thank you, Kurt. This is an experience that I never thought I would have.
Right.
But just being with these two is a real honor. I look up to both of these guys. They each served in church leadership positions, and I watched them grow and patterned some of the things I've done after what they've done.
Nice. Awesome. Now, Lynn, you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were probably my first bishop ever. You were Bishop June of 1982?
1980, February of 1980 is when I went in.
Okay.
The first time. I've served twice.
Oh, nice.
My first meeting that I conducted was under the new block schedule. The meeting I went in was the old schedule when you had Sunday school in the afternoon. So it was an experience.
And so that changed during your time as bishop?
Well, I was bishop the first time, yeah.
Wow.
Just
We'll
a young man.
definitely get into that. And Bill, you followed up with Lynn as bishop for a few months anyways.
Yes.
Is that right?
I was called as bishop, and normally I heard this story that it takes a bishop about 5 years to offend everybody in the ward. I was able to do that in 4 months.
Oh, wow. Because you were called after 4 months as the stake president, right?
4 months as bishop, and then I was called as the stake president.
Awesome.
Talk about a shocking call.
Right. Yeah. You probably went in there thinking, yeah, I'm in the clear, right? Because I'm a newbie in the bishop calling, but nonetheless, it happened. So then you were obviously released as bishop, and they followed up with this guy.
Yeah,
my
that's
dad,
correct.
Right? And those are my earliest memories of church as my dad as bishop. And even I remember being that 5-year-old or so kid, finding out he's getting released. I'm like, wait a minute, like that's a thing, and sure enough. So now, Dad, let's start with you. Our hope is to, really understand what leadership was like maybe in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It was a different time then, different processes, everything from administrative things to ministering and home teaching and things like that. But so, Dad, you were called as bishop in the 70s. What year was that?
1975.
Nice. And you're 26 years old.
I was 26 years old.
What's the story behind that? What do you remember from that process, or what was that like?
Well, we lived in Bountiful, Utah, and we were we lived on a street that was all fourplexes, and then at the end of the street was a building that had 10 apartments in it, and then just the other side was an apartment building. There probably was 100 apartments, and we'd lived there about a year, and I got a call from the stake president to come meet with the stake president. I remember it was on a Tuesday night. Went in and thinking, oh, well, maybe and as I walked in, there was a fellow who I'd only seen once that was just leaving the stake president's office, and he had just gotten married and moved into our ward. And so I went in, and the stake president visited with us, and then called me to be first counselor in the bishopric. And I just kind of stared at him like, what? and
like you felt you're too young for such callings. Right?
Yeah, like first counselor in the bishopric. I was expecting maybe the elders quorum. And yeah, we've decided to create a ward out of all these apartments. We only had 2 homes in our ward boundary, and both of those homes, the people were inactive. They never came to church. So I'm going, whoa. So I accepted and found out that the bishop was a seminary teacher. We lived right close to Woods Cross High School, and he was a seminary teacher at the Woods Cross Seminary.
Was he the guy that was leaving as you were coming? Or-
Right,
Okay.
right. And he'd been married for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And called as bishop.
And the reason they called him is the stake president knew him from being a seminary teacher. So they called him to be bishop. And I was first counselor. And the second counselor was a young man that I think he was like 23, 24 years old. And here we are starting
No experience whatsoever.
No
just-
experience.
Yeah.
And here we were in a ward made up of all apartments. So it was mainly young couples, newly married couples. And I think we only had the youth. Maybe we had 5 or 6 people that were over 12 years old in the ward. So, people would ask, I remember people asking, how you doing? I said, I don't know. We're just taking a week at a time, It was really, we had no experience. So it's like, this is just new. We're just doing what we think we need to be doing.
Yeah.
So about 9 months later, we had stake conference, and I remember pulling into the parking lot, and the bishop pulled in next to us, and we were walking into the building, and he said, well, I want to let you know, I've been transferred. I'm in the seminary program. I'm going to the Indian reservation in northern Arizona to become over the seminary there. And so I'm moving. I'm going, what?
And the knot began to form in your stomach?
And literally, all of a sudden, my heart just started to pound. It was just like I felt my heart was just going to leap out of my chest. Going, whoa.
Yeah. And to put your journey into context a little bit, I mean, you grew up in an inactive home. It's not like you saw your dad going to the church, or you didn't experience a lot of these things close up, right?
I think the first time that I really came to realize the magnitude of the bishop was when I was in the mission field. I was in southern Texas on my mission, and we would interact with bishops and so on. I came to realize, gee, how important bishops were to running the church. And so, then it was a week or so later, I was called in, and they extended the call for me to be the bishop of the ward. I'm going, whoa. So
now this was a little bit different. Maybe explain how that went back in the day with being called as bishop. It wasn't just a stake president interview, right?
No, it was just a stake president interview. I don't remember.
But didn't you have to go to meet with an apostle?
Oh, I'll tell you after.
Okay. That's later. Okay.
That's later. So, I was called the bishop, and it was in July, and so at that point you needed to be ordained by a general authority. And so
at this point, the ward has sustained you and all that?
Right. But
Okay.
I needed to be ordained. And so they told me, well, I've set up an appointment. You're going to meet with LeGrand Richards. You need to go down to the church office building. And so I took my mother came, and my wife, and then her parents, her mother, and then her second husband. When I married my wife, her father had passed away when she was in high school, and she had remarried a fellow in Ogden, and he was a stake president in the Ogden area, and he had lost his wife about a year before, and he was called to be the stake president when Spencer W. Kimball was a member of the Council of the 12. So he lost his wife, so he got an appointment with Elder Kimball, and maybe President Kimball was the president then, I can't remember, but he got an interview with President Kimball and said, "What should I do?" And President Kimball said, "Well, you need to find a new wife." And so
He found grandma, right?
he found grandma. He found my mother-in-law, and she'd been about 7 years. She'd been a widow, and they got married. So he came to this, and we sat down in LeGrand Richards' office.
So this was in church administration building?
Administration
Just his
building.
office there,
This
right?
office, and he sat behind his desk, and he kind of greeted everybody. Then I was sitting kind of right in front of him, and he looked at me, and then he proceeded to ask me the temple recommend questions.
With your mother-in-law in the room and your...
My wife and my mother, and he proceeded to go down all the questions and then I'm going, you're going, yeah, yes,
Do you keep the law of chastity? Do you? Right.
And I was like, oh, okay. And so then he ordained me a bishop. But the interesting thing is that was like, I remember it was right around the 24th of July, and on the 1st of August, another week later, the policy was changed to where they allowed stake presidents to ordain bishops. So I was one of the last bishops to be ordained by an apostle or a general authority.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a unique experience.
I bet it was, it got complicated as bishops were being called elsewhere, right? It's like you got to wait till an apostle's in town to get ordained.
Right. So they changed the policy. So that's kind of a unique experience.
Yeah. Lynn, what about you? Is there a story when you were called as bishop in the 80s?
Well, I remember specifically we had 4 young children, and we didn't tell them until Saturday night because we didn't want them saying anything to anybody. Mm-hmm. And I just remember the stark look on their face. Well, what does that mean? You're going to be the bishop. They had no clue. And that, frankly, I didn't have a clue either.
Right.
I had served in an elders quorum presidency, had never been a counselor to anything. So it was a call that was unexpected. And sometimes I think that's the best way to have that happen.
Yeah.
I was called by President Rupp, who was the stake president at the time. And what a wonderful experience to be able to learn from stake presidency. That was my biggest thing. I didn't know what to do. I had served on a high council for a little while and had a bishop, and I remember his name. He was a biology teacher, Bishop Bybee. You remember him?
I remember the name, yeah.
And I was a young 33-year-old kid who didn't know anything, and he took me under his wing, and he taught me what I needed to do as a high councilman, and that helped the transition into the bishopric.
Yeah. Yeah. And then did you serve, was it 5 years roughly that you served?
5.5, yeah. Uh-huh. And then I was released and went on vacation with my dad and my mom. We went to California, and we got down there, and it was driving me crazy because I didn't have anything to do. I didn't know what to do.
Yeah, there's that dynamic.
There's
kind of lose your identity a little bit there.
Yeah.
So, Bill, what about you? What do you remember about being called as bishop after Bishop Peterson here?
As I've been listening to these two, the call of bishop doesn't have any real strong memories in I was serving as the stake executive secretary to President Rupp for several years. What a special opportunity that was. It was really the call 4 months later to serve as the stake president that really has formed the memories in my mind.
Yeah.
And,
so what's the story behind that? I mean, there are more details as far as, it was just a routine thing that you'd be interviewed as bishop, as a new stake president was being called? And
yes, in fact, I went through all of the some of the files that I've collected through the years of church service, and I found the actual sheet of paper that was used by the general authority to interview all of the stake presidency and the high council and the bishops. And we have our pictures in here, and it's kind of interesting. I'll share that with you later if you'd like to see that.
Yeah, that's cool.
But I remember having my interview earlier in the day with all of the other leaders. And it was late in the evening, probably about 9 o'clock at night, when the phone rang and President Rupp invited me to come back to the stake center with my wife. And the call was issued to serve as the president of the stake, and that I had a couple of hours to determine who my counselors would be, because this was a Saturday night. And
Yeah.
it was going to take place on Sunday. And I just remember being completely emotionally drained.
Yeah.
And what the details of a lot of that have disappeared through my mind over the years.
Sure.
But the feeling of feeling so inadequate to step into the role of a brother that I had served with and grown to love so deeply. I just remember feeling, how can I do this? And but you get up the next morning and do your very best.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I've decided to do.
So, and it seems like that process of calling a stake president, it hasn't changed very much over the decades, right? It's general authority comes to town, lines up some interviews, and then that decision's made usually later on the day, Saturday, right?
It's amazing how that experience works. I had opportunity to do that with. Do you remember who the general authority was that called you?
I've got it written.
If you want, you can take a moment to find some stuff, and we'll just.
I mean, I remember going into the stake offices when he had been called, and at the time, I don't remember what we were doing, but for some reason I was over there, and for quite a while, it took a while to replace you as bishop, because we called you Presiop for quite a while.
Presiop.
Because he was serving as stake president and as bishop.
And the bishop.
Yeah.
It was Elder Groberg.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
Elder
Cool.
Groberg was
Former guest of the Leading Saints podcast. So
Ah.
that's cool. Yeah. That's awesome. That's
But
awesome.
you're right. The process for calling stake presidencies is pretty much the same now.
Yeah. Yeah. Dad, what do you remember about round two with being called as bishop? Here you had a bishop who only served for 4 months, and any memories there?
I remember, it was a week or so after. I don't remember the time frame, but my wife and I had gone. It was like a Friday night, as I remember. We'd gone to a play at the Pioneer Playhouse downtown Salt Lake, and so we'd got home, I guess 9:30, 10 o'clock, and I don't remember. I think that they were trying to get in touch with us, and we weren't home. And I think maybe the phone rang at like 9:30, 10, and they called and said, "Hey, can you come over to the stake center and and meet with us?" And I'm like, "Well, okay." And so we went over, and the call was extended. The experience I had both times I was called, and I replaced Bill Luker as bishop, and both times, as like I said, when I was the first time when our bishop says, "Well, we're moving," my heart started to pound, and the second time it was like there was just a confirmation, "You're going to be called a bishop," and I was like, "Oh, okay," and it was kind of like, well, when is this going to happen? Let's get this over with.
Well, how long did you serve as bishop the first time then?
I served, seems like about 2.5 years. And so the first bishop I replaced only served 9 months, and I was there about 2.5 years. So we lived in an apartment, and we had an opportunity to buy a house, and so we bought this house and we moved. So being first bishop, there was the constant turnover. I mean, apartments, people were coming and going, and we'd call. I remember I must have gone through 4 or 5 in 2.5 years. I must have gone through 3 or 4 or so relief society presidents. We'd call a relief society president, and then we're moving, and so. But it was interesting. I had the same primary president the whole time that I was in as bishop, but so there was this constant turnover, and I remember people saying to me, well, how do you deal with that? And I says, well, I don't know. I've never dealt with anything different. So we just,
all I know.
That's all I know. And so we would just deal with it. So, and it was interesting is that ward, the bishop who replaced me, he only served for approximately a year, and then the stake decided to dissolve the ward. It was just almost like the stake president was inspired for this period of about 3-4 years for this ward to exist. And it's just interesting the number of people that went through the ward that, for instance, when I served bishop, my first counselor, he moved a little bit before I did, and he moved out, and he became a bishop about a year after that. Sometime later, he was called to be a counselor in the stake presidency, and today he serves as a patriarch. And just the number of people that lived in that ward that had that experience, and then they moved on. They bought a home, and they were all called the leadership experience. It was almost like it was just a training ground for a group of people, and I still have contacts with. We still get together with 3 or 4 couples that were in that ward. We get together and have dinner together, and 2 or 3 times a year, and so it's kind of an interesting experience.
Yeah, all of you kind of were called as a younger age, and maybe it was more normal back then, I don't know. But even for myself, being called as a young bishop, like it, in hindsight, I didn't know what I was doing, and I felt really, in over my head. But I'm a better member at 42 because I've sort of had these experiences. At least I feel that way, right? That I can show up, have more empathy for the leaders. Has that been your experience, or?
Oh, absolutely. It's a learning process. You learn as you go. And I remember when I was set apart the first time, President Rupp said, you receive that mantle, and that's a real thing. You cannot serve without that mantle. And when you're released, it's gone. And that's a real thing as well. Mm-hmm. So that's where you rely. I mean, sure, you're friends with a lot of people in the ward, but all of a sudden you're the pinnacle of the ward, if you will. And you have to make those decisions, and some of them are harder than others.
Yeah.
So to rely on the Spirit is the most important thing you have to do.
Yeah. As I interview leaders all around the world, I often go, ask them just generally what keeps you up at night, type of thing. You hear things as far as like mental health, pornography, just modern day social media things. If we were to go back in time, and what do you feel like, what kept you up at night back in the early 80s or 70s or so? What was the big issues that really weighed on you and your ward?
I think to me it was finances. That was dealing with financial problems, ward budget, stake budget, temple budget. Those were difficult. We had a very, very young ward, and we're all newlyweds, small children, and yet here we're trying to build a temple, take care of the building, and we were way, way behind. So to me, that was hard, the finance part of stuff.
Anything else come up? Any other subjects that you felt like?
Well, I think the finances, I don't know if people today realize that back then, the budget, the ward budget, you had to pay for electricity in the building and everything that happened. The church takes care of all that now, but we had to be constantly mentioning the ward budget, and then the stake, you had to pay so much to the stake because the stake depended on, that's where their income came from, and so it was a task to just constantly be able to keep the income, because people are paying tithing, plus they were paying fast offering, plus they were paying ward budget. That was constant.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember tithing settlement, but here you had your opportunity to meet with members coming in and say, okay, well, how much do you feel like you could to pay a month towards the ward budget? So it was
so it wasn't just 10% that members were expected.
No.
It was 10% plus.
right.
And so what was that process like? I mean, did you stand up and constantly remind them from the podium, or was it in these private meetings, or what do you remember from that?
I don't know that we ever announced it over the pulpit. It was an opportunity to meet one-on-one with mom and dad and the kids, of course.
Like during tithing settlement, or even
During tithing
outside?
settlement,
Okay.
right. Do tithing settlement first, but then in preparation for all that, you've got to realize you've got a ward budget, a stake budget, a temple, missionaries, and so you have to work all that up and determine, well, how much can you give to help us in all these other fields?
Yeah.
So it was a lot of work.
Now, this is the area I grew up in, and that you raised your family. This is West Valley City. It's not known as the affluent area of Salt Lake Valley, right? So it wasn't that you were dealing with people with lots of wealth, but nonetheless, the church. I mean, if you didn't meet your budget, I mean, what happened? You just didn't have electricity that week, or what?
I just remember one experience, and that was we were also raising money for the scouting program.
Oh yeah, Friends of Scouting.
No, I don't.
Maybe it was
remember
something
what it was
different.
called.
Yeah.
It was something else, but anyway, and we'd collected a lot of money for that particular forum for the Boy Scouts, and it was considerable. A couple $1,000s, and I thought, oh, good. Well, we were also way behind on stake budget, and the stake presidency member said, no, you take that money and you put it in. And I went, well, wait a minute. Then he says, that's where it should go. It worked out perfectly. So it was difficult.
But there's a lot of those things happening behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Yeah. Bill, what do you remember from the stake perspective, just with finances? And I mean, were you always shaking down the bishops like, hey, here's your due?
You mentioned finances. I remember when the Jordan River Temple, this happened probably just before we were called, but the Jordan River Temple was built without using tithing dollars from the church. And to my knowledge, it may be the only temple in the world that's done this, where the members of the church in that temple district contributed all of the cash to build the Jordan River Temple. As I was going through some of my history notes, that memory came to my mind. But the opportunity to using the paper technology of the time, keep track of all of that. I remember the constant after sacrament meeting and everything was done, having the clerk and a member of the bishopric go to the bank and deposit all that. Maybe that still happens today, probably not to the extent that it did.
Not as much money
back in the 70s and 80s. But so finances was certainly one of the things that we dealt with. I just remember dealing with the personal challenges that members of the ward or the stake would come in and deal with. And it had one of the hymns that we sing today that has some words that really brought to my mind recently. Who am I to judge another when I walk imperfectly? I remember having often those feelings as I was meeting with people, trying to counsel them and help them through a difficult challenge in their lives. And yet feeling the great love that Heavenly Father had for them individually, and really his support for me and giving me promptings of things that would help them through those challenges.
Yeah. Anything else with like finances that come to mind? So I imagine the power bill would just be mailed to your house, and then you'd have to figure it out.
I think the stake paid the power. We didn't pay. I don't remember. Did we pay bills?
I don't remember that.
I don't remember it, but we'd have to have we'd collect ward budget, and then we had an assessment to the stake, and the money would go to them, and then they would, I assumed, would take care of the bills that we'd have. I remember one instance where we had a family in our ward that their son, their oldest son, was going on a mission, and these are folks that were had financial struggles, and they just weren't able to support this young man on a mission. And so we wanted to get this young man out. So I remember lining up interviews with a dozen or so members in the ward that we felt like we could ask to see if they could contribute so much a month while he was on the mission. So I remember calling those people in and sitting down with them, and some saying, yeah, I would be happy to help. Others saying, I'm sorry, we just can't afford help out. And so it was, a struggle.
Well, and that was the constant to me, is you were always meeting with someone with some kind of an issue, be it financial, be it physical, whatever. But to me, that was difficult, but you always had others you can rely on in the ward that you could call on to help with these types of things. To me, you serve with brethren like this, you have counselors, and the camaraderie that you build in serving in the church, whether it be primary or bishop or stake president, that's where you really gain opportunities to help, and you learn from the other people. I mean, as a young bishop, you're sitting there and someone comes in with a real problem. Oh, now what do I do?
Yeah.
Again, that's when you rely on the Spirit. But then you have counselors that you can go to as well.
Yeah.
To say, hey, we've got a situation. How would you face this?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the counselor we go to is Heavenly Father, and that's spending a lot of time on your knees.
Yeah.
With your ward leadership.
What about like just more of an administrative action of like cutting a check, right? I remember as a bishop in the system, I put the paper in the printer and out comes a check, we sign it, or it's even the clerk just runs the check over to my house, I sign it and he's on his way, right? What do you remember about, how did you cut a check?
Well,
maybe you don't remember.
I don't remember.
Well, I remember, basically if it was a Sunday, then you'd go to the financial clerk who was in the clerk's office and say, hey, we need to cut a check for this amount. Sometimes I, as a bishop, if I met with somebody who needed, for instance, they came and they needed some assistance from fast offerings, I would have to go cut the check myself, and then I'd have to go run down one of my counselors and get him to sign it. And so there was always that situation. Back to the other situation, I remember with budget, my mind tells me that we were kind of struggling budget-wise, so we lined up interviews with folks in the ward, and I specifically remember there was a sister in our ward who was a widow, and I think she had two daughters. They were teenage daughters, and I remember her coming in, and she worked, but she struggled financially, but she never came to me for help. But I asked her if she could help with the budget. And I remember her just saying, well, I think I can give a relatively small amount. And it just reminded me of the widow and
the widow's mite. Yeah.
The widow's mite is, I was just touched that she was going to sacrifice to help the budget. She didn't have a lot, but what she could contribute, she would contribute.
Wow.
Well, and we were holding budget dinners, dime a dip.
Oh, really?
For raise money for the ward budget. So you'd have a ward dinner, and you'd invite people to not only bring the food, but now for every spoonful you got, it cost you a dime or a quarter or whatever, just trying to make ends meet.
Yeah.
You'd come and you'd say, okay, it's a budget dinner. Well, we need you to give us $10, $15, $20 and come. I remember, speaking of that, as a young man, they would have budget cards. Do you remember the budget cards? And so I remember my grandparents were not active in the church, but they would pay budget, and they'd have a budget card, and I'd be there. And one of my best friends growing up lived right next door to my grandparents, and on Saturday night they would have a movie at the church on Saturday night. But to get into the movie, you had to take your budget card and show your budget card at the door to get into the movie. Okay, so it was kind of, here's the reward. You get to go, and they would have a Disney movie or something on Saturday night, and then they'd sell popcorn and candy and things like. Did you have that experience?
Yeah.
I remember the the Saturday night movies.
Right. And so that was quite common in the church to have, and when I was first married, we moved into a ward, and that was a big deal in the ward. They literally had a room that was with a projector, and they just like a movie theater. They had it that would shoot in the cultural hall and shoot it out towards the screen. So it was budget to raise money for activities.
Interesting. So if the youth wanted to go do whatever, you had to figure out where that money was coming from. And
well, you had to set up a budget every year, some for the gals, some for the guys. The primary, all the organizations had needs, and so you'd have to work that all up. And again, that's when tithing settlement came up. That's when you discussed all of that.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't, you did. And I remember vividly when I served on the High Council, once a year we'd have this High Council meeting. It was all about the budget, and we'd go over the budget and go over all the line items, and then the stake president would ask for a sustaining vote from all the High Councilors. You sustain this budget, and we'd move forward, and then they would say, okay, they would assign each ward, here's how much you need to pay this year in your budget. And so you as a bishopric, you had, we've got to come up with this money every year.
Wow.
To meet the budget.
Right. Man, that would be so overwhelming to me, that someone who's not a numbers guy, or I can barely do my own budget, let alone the church's or the ward's budget, right? But and you see, I mean, that clerk position back then was crucial, right?
Yes.
I mean,
yeah.
Where now, I mean, obviously I don't want to diminish what they do, but it's so electronic now, and systems have been streamlined that there's maybe not that as much going on in the clerk's office.
But it's interesting, though, the same process applies today as it did back then, as far as accounting for the funds and administering to the funds. Yeah. You don't type out the green receipts anymore, but those clerks are still involved in all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything with like welfare that I haven't mentioned, Dad, you got to tell, this is one of my favorite dad stories of when you were, the first time you were a bishop and you used fast offering funds in a unique way. Do you remember this?
So one night I get a phone call, and there was a young single sister in the ward, and I'm not sure, I think I remember right, she had a dog, and I think the dog barked or something, and so their neighbors had called the police on her several times about this barking dog, and anyway, the police came and arrested her
for a barking dog.
and so I get this phone call that she is in jail. Okay.
You were her one call, was the bishop.
Well, it's like, and I don't know that I don't remember if she had family local or what she was, but anyway, so I was at the point is like, and she's in jail. Like, okay, what do I do? And somebody said, well, you need to bail her out of jail. So I wrote a check for the bail and bailed her out of jail. And, so
just doing the bishop thing, just helping people out.
About
right?
a month or so later, I was having my monthly interview with the stake president, and he said, got something to discuss with you. You wrote a check for bail? That's not policy. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I didn't know. I was like, up against the wall, and I didn't feel like, she needed to spend the night in jail. And so I bailed her out. So that was...
That's nice. The only mistake he made as bishop. That's amazing. That's amazing.
So I remember bail when I was bishop the first time. The apartments, the church building was just across the street. So Sunday, people would come in and say, I need some help, And so the problem with a apartment ward, people are coming and going. You get new people, and they'd show up maybe a week, and then they're coming knocking at your door. Oh, I need to visit with you, Bishop. We need help with finances. I need paying their rent or food or, those type of things. So I would say, okay. So I made arrangements with the custodian, who was somebody in our ward or in the stake. I'd make arrangements, and he'd be there Monday morning. And I says, well, he'd say, just send them over. 8:30, 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and I'll have them help me clean the building, So, and to me, that was the best way, is that I'd say, well, okay, if you need some help, I need you to go over tomorrow. Or I said, when can you go over to the building and help clean it? And then I'll visit with you later in the week. So it was always my test. If they showed up and did the cleaning at the building, then I would have further discussion as we'd help them out. But it was a real way to separate the men from the boys, If they didn't show up, I'd just say, well, until you show up, I just really can't help you until... and so that was... You
could gauge their sincerity that way, or how urgent it was.
Right. And so I remember that experience.
Yeah. Any other welfare memories or experiences?
Well, I think they're similar today as they were back then. People get themselves way in debt for whatever reason, and they wait till the last minute, and all of a sudden you, as a new bishop or a seasoned bishop, have the experience of trying to, okay, what do I do? How do I help these people without jeopardizing anything else? And so I don't think that's too much different now than it would have been back then.
Were you like, now obviously I was a bishop in South Salt Lake, and I think the amount of fast offering funds I spent, we contributed about 10% of that. So we want to thank the wards in Draper and Alpine for supplementing that. Was it more of a thing that you could only spend what your ward brought in for fast offerings? Remember that? Or maybe that's too long ago, too much of a detail.
I remember you kind of knew how much fast offerings you had to come in. And then if you were going to be short, then you'd contact the stake president. And because at the end of the month you had extra, the monies would be transferred to the stake, and the stake would hold on to that money for a period of time. So they always had some money. So my thinking was, if the stake didn't have enough, then it was calling downtown Salt Lake and say, hey, we've got this problem. And you had to get approval, so to do that. But there was always, you could always go to the stake, and there was always seemed to be enough to help you to cover your expenses.
And I remember I was on this side of this process, is you'd send little teachers like me out to go knock doors and gather the fast offerings, right? Where that, I don't know, and even in the Utah wards I've lived in, that's less of a thing. But, now paying, online is so streamlined, but for sure. Bill, anything else as far like aside from finances, any administrative thing or spiritual thing? What do you remember from your time as stake president that comes to the surface?
I remember some stake conference sessions with some of the general authorities that would come to visit our stake, and I remember the Saturday evening or the Saturday morning, afternoon sessions that those brethren would be with us, and we would get out the statistical reports and go through the data, and much of the counsel of those brethren that came to help us was to strengthen our stake and to point out maybe where we could do better, where we were not doing as well as perhaps we could. And so I remember as a stake conference was coming up, I would look at the possible areas where we would be concentrating with that general authority, where we could help, and tried to do our best. But many of those situations were a little stressful.
I bet.
And pointing out, well, yeah, you've done great here. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about where you need to do better. And the general authorities were always assigned to come to conferences at the time by the president of the Quorum of the 12. Mm-hmm. And I remember clearly when Howard W. Hunter was the president of the Quorum of the 12, and he assigned himself to come to our stake to preside over a stake conference.
Oh, wow.
And I remember looking, wow, that is an interesting coincidence that the one who's assigning all of these stake conferences would assign himself to our stake. And I remember he was nearing the end of his life at the time, was in a wheelchair. And I remember preparing removing one of the chairs, the Bolden chairs at the pulpit in the chapel for him to come in, and church security would be there with him and so on. But I remember clearly when he came in to our Saturday meeting, and church security brought him into my office and closed the door, and it was President Hunter and me. I sat in my chair, he was sitting next to me, and I thought, well, here is where he's going to help me find out where we need to be better as a stake. And I'll never forget this. He looked at me and said, President Luker, what can I do to help you?
Oh, wow.
The feeling of emotion and love that came from him as we spent time together discussing the joys and the challenges of serving in priesthood leadership. And the details of much of that conversation have since left. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've had a few sunrises and sunsets in my life, and gratefully some of the memories are now gone. And I'm grateful to listen to these two wonderful brethren and the messages and the memories that they still have, that much of that detail is left for me. But I hope I will never forget the great emotion I felt as the member of the quorum, the president of the Quorum of the 12, Howard Hunter, who soon became the president of the church, had those few precious moments with me as we discussed the sacred work and the truth of the restoration of the gospel.
Wow, great story. I love that. And now back then, I forget when this changed, but stake conferences used to be quarterly, right? Rather than every 6 months. Was that
a quarterly experience? That's correct.
Remember, you used to keep all the agenda on a TRS 80. Remember that?
Now you remember more details than I do.
So what's a TRS 80? You first got to start there.
After he was called to be the stake president, then I got to serve as his executive secretary for quite a while.
Oh, okay.
And that's a great experience. But he was computer literate. TRS 80 was an old Radio Shack computer that was probably as big as any of these chairs here. And he was computer literate. He was able to put all those agendas in there. And I didn't even know what a computer was back then.
And so that would save it, and you could just adjust as...
But it was 4 times a year, not just 2 times a year.
Yeah.
So I remember one day sitting in meeting, and he says, okay, we've just finished stake conference. Let's start planning the next one.
Yeah.
And we did.
Well, I mean, especially quarterly. I mean, that'd be like you never stopped doing stake conferences.
Yeah. True story.
That's awesome. Lynn, what do you remember just from you were at Bishop when the block schedule kind of was universalized? What do you remember? Is there a story behind that, or did you get a letter, or how'd that go?
Well, when I was called, I knew the block was coming.
Oh, okay.
We knew it was coming. And so we had 1 week to prepare, but there were, I think, 3 or 4, I don't remember, 4 wards in the building. And so we had to met out times. The only thing I remember is the first experience that I had is going home to my wife and saying, hey, sweetheart, the block schedule's coming up and we're going to have sacrament meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning with 4 small children. And the look on her face was, what? 8 o'clock in the morning? And so that's one of my first memories of the block schedule.
Yeah. And once you got kind of those general details out of the way, it seemed like you kind of were locked in and took your time. And,
and away it went.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the miracles of the whole process was it was a smooth transition. It took a while to get used to, but it was still a smooth transition.
Yeah. So. Awesome. Any other memories of block schedule or just schedule in general? Or
maybe this is off the subject here, but one of the things that I remember specifically about the stake is the opportunity that Bill here set with us putting on the Music Man as a stake. And that involved the entire stake. Mm-hmm. We rented out the Promise Valley Playhouse downtown in Salt Lake City.
Which is no longer there.
No.
Yeah.
Well, the facade's there, but there's nothing behind it. And how many performances did we do?
It was 2 or 3 nights.
2 or 3 nights, as I recall.
So all of the stake was involved in the writing process and in the acting process, and we sold tickets and we paid for all of that. And
so was this another budget fundraiser type thing? Is that the reason you did it, or?
No, I think it was just a more of an activity.
It was, I think fellowshipping and just
right. So a lot of the stakes would do a play, or I think it came from road shows, and we us when we grew up, road shows were a big deal, and then even when we lived, I remember having to call someone to be over the road show, so I don't know that a lot of members even today know what a road show is.
If your church has a stage, it's there because of the road shows, right? Because right now we're like, why do we have a stage? So kids just fall off of them.
So road shows was basically, I remember as a kid, is you had what 6, 7, 8 wards in it, and so you would start at one building and perform the road show, then you'd
take it on the road.
Take it on the road. You'd all load it up in trucks, and you'd move down to the next building, and then somebody another ward would be right behind you. So you were giving that night, there'd be 2 or 3 buildings that you'd give that show 3 or 4 times during the night, and then they would have a rating. They pick the best road show. And then I remember at one point then they'd have a region. So you'd pick all the stakes in your area, and then you'd pick your best road show, and you would have a night when you would compete against other stakes in the area, and have it was a competition.
Wow.
And so road shows, that was serious business. I mean, there were people, and I think Janice was involved in that. And it was to write the road show. I mean, people spent hours upon hours putting those. Yeah.
You didn't just do a classic play. You would create your own.
You create your own show, and it was a big deal. It was.
I have memories of my older teenage siblings waking up early before school to go practice the road show and then get to school, so it was definitely a thing. So, and would you say just in general, I mean, church was much more of a community thing, right? Like, I mean, now we still do the Christmas parties and things, but there's a lot more maybe going on down at the church house than we have today. Would that be accurate? Or?
Well, I think if you in your building, you'd have 3 or 4 wards, and so they'd have each have a night for mutual, and so Tuesday night there would be a ward over there, and next night, and so there was always something going on at the church building during the week from Tuesday through Thursday, and so then basketball was always a big deal. I mean, and so. At 9 o'clock, a bunch of guys would show up and want to play basketball at the church, and so then we got to where somebody in the high council had to come and tell them they had to go home at 11 o'clock at night, and And so there was always something going on at the church during the week.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's just modern society, families are pulled in different directions and have different distractions or focuses, that way. So, any other story, concept? I don't want to lead you too much if there's a good story out there, or just any leadership dynamic or...
I remember one episode in our stake. I was feeling an opportunity and a need to increase the temple attendance and work within the stake. And back then, you could do family history work and then assign the names into your stake folder. Is that still possible, Rick, to do that today? I don't think it is.
No, it's not.
But so the members of our stake were challenged to do their family research and to assign those names into our stake folder at the Jordan River Temple.
But you can have like groups now, right?
Right.
But not at the temple. They didn't have a...
And then the stake members would go, and if they didn't have their family names, they could go to the stake folder and take those names. And I remember the goal was to create a new stake in the other side of the veil.
Oh, yeah.
The name of our stake was the Taylorsville North Central Stake, TNCS. And I remember, as the very last name to create this new stake, my wife and I arrived at the temple and the last name was given to me. And as we came through the veil, I remember at the next stake meeting announcing to the stake that TNCS was no longer the Taylorsville North Central Stake. It was the newly created stake.
Oh, nice.
In the other side of the veil. That's a sweet memory I have of the concentration and the importance of focusing on the house of the Lord.
Yeah. And I just love those stories of just stimulating that engagement, the unity of a stake or ward to come together to accomplish those types of things.
Well, and that, to me, that's what a ward family is that unity that gets built as you serve together in a capacity. When you look at these three old guys right here and realize the number of years we've been together and the experiences we've had together, that bond is still there. And you create that as a ward. It's a little bit different, in my mind, of serving in the stake because you don't have that close interaction as you do in a ward. And that's the beauty of a ward, is the bond that you create with the members of the ward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that may be a good time to bring up I just love this tradition you've kept up with getting together. Because just being in different bishoprics and stake presidencies, whatever, there's such a brotherhood there. There's such connection or just being in the same ward with people. And so, how do you describe what goes on when you guys get together still for dinner? How does that work and how do you organize it?
Well, I guess we started in 1986.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Oh, wow.
And it was just, hey, let's go to dinner. And so we did 2 or 3 times. Then finally, in early, I think it's 1987, we decided to start keeping track. And so we had to have a name. And so we named ourselves
the Gourmands.
The Gourmands.
Gourmands, yeah.
And so we'd go out every quarter, and each couple would select where we're going to go. Now, we've been doing that since 1986, and we do it today as well.
Yeah.
We've added a couple other players there, but that's okay too.
So every time when it was your time, you picked the place and you never told the other group where we're going to eat until that night. We'd all get together and say, oh, we're going to go to this place. And we've had some interesting experiences.
And throughout all of these years, we've only been back maybe 2 or 3 times to the same place.
Mm-hmm.
So
We've been back to a restaurant at the same location, but a different restaurant, different name. We've gone, and I remember one time we went and the place we were going to go to was closed. Seemed like it was closed, and so we just had to drive down the street and says, "Oh, there's a place. Let's go to that place."
Well, and we keep track of, hey, what did we talk about while we were there? Maybe a son or a daughter got a mission call, or
And so Lynn has kept track of that on his computer. So he has a
the
list.
TR, what was it? That
TSR.
TSR.
But now he keeps track, and so every once in a while he'll send us an email with attachment showing all the places that we've been and
what we talked about.
And what we talked about.
That's cool.
And so that's
again the camaraderie.
Yeah.
As you serve.
Yeah, because you two have. My dad still lives in my childhood home, but you two have moved on, and so what a great way to stay connected.
Stay connected. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the eternities? Just a little bit of an eternity watch as we sit here, but the eternities forever.
Yeah.
What a great opportunity and example of being together as a family forever.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like you need a foodie blog. You visited all these restaurants.
We could tell you stories of where not to go.
Yeah, I bet.
And what not to eat while you're there.
Yeah, I bet. Any reflection on like as you see other up and coming young leaders? I mean, what advice would you give to new bishops or new elders quorum presidents, or just from both what you're monitoring or what you're seeing and also what you've experienced? What comes to mind with advice for leaders?
I have the advice that as I see is I think that sometimes bishops get so wrapped up in making things happen. And I think if the advice I'd give to a bishop, make an effort to shake hands with as many people as you can on Sunday. Just greet them and say, "How you doing?" and shake their hands. I think sometimes I see that bishops are so busy, they walk right by people, and it's like, wow, he didn't even stop and say hello. Make an effort to say, because there's a lot of good, active, strong members who come week in and week out that don't ever have the opportunity to shake the bishop's hand, We're not asking for his time. Just shake his hand, greet him, and say, "It's good to see you," and let them know that we still appreciate you.
Yeah.
So I think that's the best thing, because when it's all over and done with, people are only going to remember the relationship. They're not going to remember about what happened in sacrament meeting,
or if the meeting started on time, or
start on time, but they will remember, oh, that bishop was always made an effort to say hello to me, and acknowledge me for the day.
Yeah.
Well, that's where the concept of true love comes through, because as you serve, you love the people that you're serving. Now, you might not like what they're doing sometimes, but you love them, and they in turn return that to you. And again, that's what brings it all together.
I think we spend a lot of time now talking about ministering, and we're always saying, well, but I think really number one in the ministering is just going up and shaking somebody's hand on Sunday and saying, "Good to see you." For me, that I've been ministered to. I've been recognized for just a moment of time, and I don't need anything more.
Yeah. What comes to mind with you, Bill?
Early in my church leadership experience, I came across a story. I'll share it with you, that I have thought about many, many times during the years of my life. And well, let me share it with you, and then I'll tell you my feelings. wishing to encourage her young son in his progress in playing the piano. And by the way, music has been a very important part of my life.
Yeah.
A mother decided to take her small boy to a Paderewski concert. And they were seated, and then the mom saw a friend of hers and went over to visit with the friend. Well, the young man thought, this is my opportunity to go explore. And so he wandered around and entered a door that said, no admission. When the house lights dimmed and the concert was about to begin, the mother returned to her seat and could not find her son. Suddenly, the curtain opened and the spotlight focused on the beautiful piano. In horror, the mother saw her little boy sitting at the keyboard, innocently picking out Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. At that moment, the great piano master quickly moved to the piano and whispered in the little boy's ear, "Don't quit. Keep playing." Then leaning over, the piano master reached around the little boy's back and with his left hand began filling in the bass part. Soon his right arm reached around the other side of the young man, and he added a running obbligato. Together, the old master and the young novice transformed a frightening situation into a wonderful creative experience. The audience was mesmerized. And here's the lesson that I learned. It's in the same way that God deals with us. What can I accomplish on my own is hardly noteworthy. We try our best, but the results aren't exactly graceful flowing music. But when the hand of the master, our life's work truly can become beautiful. Next time you set out to accomplish a great feat, listen carefully, and you will hear the voice of the master whispering in your ear, "Don't quit. Keep playing." Feel his loving arm around you. Know that his strong hands are playing the concert of your life. I remember coming across that story years ago as in my early days of being a church leader. And I would often recite that to myself as I say, I have lots of heavy responsibilities. I'm, in a way, pinking out Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But the Lord has called me to do this, and I can feel his arms around me, helping me do what I have been called to do. Those are sweet memories that come to my life.
I love that. So I love that story. And isn't that, if there's anything that hasn't changed in the decades, is we all still feel inadequate, and we all still feel the presence of God that's really creating miracles and manifesting his glory. You know, just story after story of witnessing, like there's nothing I couldn't have done what I just witnessed, you know, the change in people. And it's awesome. It's really good.
You know, to me, what I would suggest to a newly called individual who is called perhaps as bishop is just be yourself. The Lord prepared you. You may not be prepared, but the Lord prepared you. And just like our story says, just wait, you'll get the answer. So,
yeah.
Don't be
awesome.
something you're not.
It's awesome. Well, and I think it's, you know, it's important to recognize just the ongoing influence that leaders have, obviously with the help of God. But I mean, every birthday I can't help but think of orange creamsicles as my home teacher, Lynn Peterson, would show up on my doorstep. And as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, I knew that I could determine I was sharing those orange creamsicles. And then the stake president, who's also a magician. I remember so many of your magic tricks from the stage, and just thinking, how's he do that? It must be the priesthood. I don't know.
The tie.
Yeah, he had always
I still have the magic tie.
Still the magic tie, and I've shouted out your wife Janice before on the podcast, just as a young bishop's visiting primary from time to time, and I could just envision the pictures, the actions that she would do because as the primary music leader. And of course, my dad, I mean, that influence goes on and on, recognizing that maybe 28-year-old Bishop Francom could figure this out because 26-year-old Bishop Francom figured it out, other than bailing people out of jail. But I never made that mistake, thanks to my dad. So anyways, I hope you feel that I mean, we could flood this room with people who've been impacted by that leadership and who continue on the covenant path today because of that influence. So I got one more question that I'll have y'all answer, but any other point, principle, story that must be told, it can be a little off topic or whatever, but anything you've been saving, or did we cover it all?
Well, maybe a specific. I remember specifically interviewing a young lady and her mother, and there was some infidelity involved in there. And as a young man, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say, and I said something I probably shouldn't have said. And I offended the mother. Not meaning to, but I did. That kind of haunts you a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, be yourself. The Lord directs this church, not the bishop, not the stake president. The Lord directs the church, no matter where you are. Teaching primary, follow that counsel, and you cannot go wrong.
Yeah, I love that. And just recognizing, just having grace for yourself of the silly things we say, so trying to do our best, right? So, any others?
I have, the thought comes to mind is when I was called the first time as bishop, and people coming in and sitting down and them unloading their problem in life, and I'm going, I have not a clue what, an answer. And it was almost as if sometimes it's as if on the wall in the office, it was almost like a chalkboard that someone was writing the answer on his chalkboard, and says, "Oh, this is what you should say." I'm going, "Oh, okay," and that was, it was like, whoa, because I had no clue, I had no experience, I had I was just, but I felt like the Lord was just writing out an answer for me on the chalkboard. Yeah, and I'd share that.
Yeah, that's great. Oftentimes, as people will respond, maybe to a positive experience, like, I'm so grateful for these words or what you did for me, and I just say, I just work here. The rest is God's actually doing that. I just work here. So, any others? We covered it well?
I think we're okay.
This is great. All right, last question I have for you, we'll start with you, Lynn, is as you reflect on your time as a leader, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
That's an interesting question, because I have the great opportunity now to be a co-primary chorister.
Oh, cool.
With my wife. And I've thought about that. How am I a better person having served in different capacities? And to me, it all comes back to the fact that I know who I am. I know where I came from. I know where I'm going. I've experienced things that I didn't think I'd ever experienced before, but to rely on Heavenly Father, no matter what it is, your situation is. No matter what calling you have, you rely on Heavenly Father and the saving grace of Jesus Christ, and you'll be just fine.
Awesome. Bill, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
What Lynn said is absolutely true. As I look back on the years of opportunity to serve, many of the details may have disappeared from my mind, but the realization that sticks with me is Heavenly Father has been with me. As I, referring to that previous story, don't quit, just keep going. And the promptings of the Spirit come in most needed moments. Years ago, I learned that even dreams can have a spiritual presentation. And I began at that moment in time, decades ago, to carry pieces of paper with me and my pen in my pocket everywhere I go. Because sometimes the impressions will come at unexpected moments of things that I need to remember and to do. but to have felt through these many years the love of the Lord and helping me through both wonderfully challenging and sometimes stressful moments. But I have felt his arms around me as he kept telling me, don't quit, just keep playing. And I love the Lord and I hope he knows how much I love him.
Awesome. Thank you. Dad, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
Well, I think the one thing that comes to mind is as I've been out of leadership and I sit in meetings or sacrament meeting, and the bishopric gets up and they trip and stumble and make mistakes. I sit back and say, okay, I thought maybe you need to tell them, and I said, no, just stand back. They don't need any criticism. They just need to be supportive of what they're doing, and they'll figure it out. And they may do it a better way than I would have done it. But so I think the older you get, you say, well, I need to go and tell them how to do it. So I think I've just learned to just sit back and let them, and let them know if you talk to them, hey, if the bishop gives a talk, go up and say, that was a good job. Let them know that I'm here to support you, and I'm not here to be critical of what you're doing, because I was there one time and I messed up too. So I think I'm just trying to be kind and do the best I can. And so I appreciate I think having leadership and having the help of the Lord, the Spirit guide and direct you, and just say what a wonderful experience to know that someone cared, and that Heavenly Father cared, and he was helping me all along the way. And I felt his reassurance and everything's going to be fine, and we move on. And I felt that the love that he shares with me, and I'm grateful for that.